The smell reached him before the light did. It was organic, animal, wrong, the kind of wrong that lived below conscious thought and spoke directly to the part of the brain that had kept human beings alive through ice ages and wildfires, and the long dark centuries before electricity. Yusuf Khalid pressed himself flat against the outer wall of the hut and held his breath, and the smell kept coming anyway. Something alive inside. Something that had been inside for a long time. The hut itself was barely standing. It had been a storage structure of some kind, built from the compressed mineral slabs the Veth used for their outbuildings, dense, gray-brown blocks that absorbed heat during the day and bled it slowly through the night. 3 of its 4 walls were intact. The 4th had collapsed inward, where a Veth patrol drone had clipped it during the strike 2 weeks ago. From the outside, it looked like a ruin. From the outside, it looked like nothing anyone would bother entering. That was probably the point. Yusuf shifted his field kit on his shoulder and listened. Behind him, the forward operating base was 4 kilometers south, 4 kilometers of fractured road, 2 dead checkpoints, and the narrow corridor that the 14th Expeditionary had carved through the occupied zone. Ahead of him, the hut, and inside it, that smell. He was supposed to be assessing civilian infrastructure in the grid, taking notes, tagging structures that were load-bearing and structures that weren't, so the engineers could figure out which ones they could use as cover during the next push. Standard advance work. Nobody had said anything about this. Nobody ever said anything about this. He pushed through the collapsed section of wall, stepping carefully over the broken slabs, and let his eyes adjust to the dark. She was in the far corner. His first thought, fast, involuntary, the kind of thought the brain produces before the thinking part of the brain catches up, was that she was dead. She was absolutely still. Her back was curved against the corner wall, her legs drawn up, her arms wrapped around something pressed against her chest. Her coloring was the deep iridescent gray-green of the Highland Veth, the kind that shaded toward violet in certain lights, and she was dressed in what had been fine clothing once, layered silks, hand-embroidered at the hem with something that looked like circuit work and turned out on closer inspection to be exactly that. Conductive thread, pattern encoded, the kind of thing you saw on Veth nobility. Then she moved, just her eyes. They found him in the dark with the absolute precision of a predator's eyes, the pale bioluminescent iris opening like a shutter, and Yusuf felt every hair on his body stand up. He did not run. He had stopped running from things a long time ago. He had learned in the field in the cold, small hours before dawn when the casualties came in faster than the equipment could handle them, that the moment you ran from something, you gave it all the power it had over you. You could be afraid. Fear was fine. Fear was useful information, but you kept your feet. He lowered himself slowly into a crouch, making himself small, making himself low, keeping his hands visible. "I'm a doctor," he said, and then because he knew enough Veth to be dangerous, "Iyaraket, shun, Iyaraket. I mean no harm, peace, I mean no harm." Her expression did not change, but she pulled the thing against her chest slightly tighter, and in doing so she shifted, and the faint gray light from the collapsed wall caught the bundle she was holding, and Yusuf saw the small hand. A child's hand, four-fingered like adult Veth, but small, very small, infant small. The fingers curled loosely around the edge of the silk wrapping, palm up, completely relaxed with the boneless certainty of deep sleep. Yusuf sat down on the floor. He did it deliberately, clumsily, making himself ungainly, making himself unthreatening, sitting cross-legged on the cold mineral floor of the ruined hut, and setting his field kit down beside him with a gentle click. He kept his hands flat on his knees. He kept his eyes level with hers. "I won't touch the child," he said, first in English and then in Veth. "I won't call for anyone. I'm going to sit here for a moment because my feet hurt, and then I'm going to leave." The pale eyes watched him. He could hear her breathing now, shallow, controlled, the breathing of someone who had been holding themselves together through an act of sustained will for longer than any human body should be able to manage. He'd heard that breathing before. He'd heard it in a village in Kandahar when he was 23 and had been doing disaster relief with a UN medical team, and a woman had been pulled out of the rubble of her own house 3 days after the collapse. That same quality of breathing. Still alive, still here through sheer refusal. He reached into his field kit and took out his water bottle. He took a long drink himself, showing her first, showing her it was water, showing her he swallowed it, and then he set it down in the space between them, a careful neutral distance, and left it there. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. "You speak Veth," she said. Her voice was low, resonant, the vowel harmonics of a formal dialect, not the sharp trade Veth he'd picked up from the soldiers and the markets, but something older and more structured, the kind of Veth they apparently taught in whatever passed for an aristocratic household. "Badly," he said, "I apologize." Something crossed her face that might have been, in different circumstances, close to amusement. "You sit on the floor," she said, "in front of a stranger." "My back will complain about it later," Yusuf agreed. "I'm doing it anyway." The child shifted in her arms. A small, searching sound, not quite a cry, the sound of a sleeping infant registering something in the distance, a change in temperature, a shift in the quality of the air, and then settling back down. The mother's arms tightened. Her jaw tightened. Her whole body performed the micro-adjustment of someone absorbing pain without expressing it, and for a moment Yusuf thought she might be injured, and then the child's hand moved and he saw it. Under the silk wrapping at the curve of the child's inner wrist, a small raised mark, circular, slightly darker than the surrounding skin, the size of a lentil. Regular and perfectly symmetrical, with the smooth geometry of something manufactured. He recognized it immediately. He recognized it because he had a colleague in the 14th's intelligence section, a signals analyst named Devuru who had briefed him 3 weeks ago about the Veth State Authority's enforcement protocols in occupied zones. The VSA issued tracker beads to all Veth nationals in contested territory. Adults got them voluntarily, or what the VSA called voluntarily, which meant the alternative was detention. Children under 2 cycles, the Veth developmental stage that roughly corresponded to human infancy, got them implanted without consent, lodged subcutaneously at the inner wrist, dormant until activated by the authorities' sweep frequencies. Dormant but not silent, not invisible. If someone ran a standard VSA sweep through this grid, and the VSA ran standard sweeps through every contested grid every 48 hours, as regular and remorseless as tides, the bead would respond. It would respond even through the mineral walls of the hut. It would respond even through the rubble and the silence and the darkness. And the response would carry a location, and the location would carry a child. Yusuf sat very still and looked at the tracker in the child's wrist and thought about the last VSA sweep through this grid. 43 hours ago. He looked at the mother. She was already looking at him. She had been watching his eyes, watching where they went, watching the exact moment his gaze found the bead. He saw her see him understand. He saw the knowledge pass between them, what he knew, that she knew he knew. And he saw what it cost her to hold still, to not move, to keep her face controlled when every instinct she had was telling her the same thing her instincts had been telling her for however many days she'd been in this corner of this ruined hut. Run, but there was nowhere to run. "How long?" he asked quietly in Veth. She was silent for a moment, then 11 days. 11 days with a newborn. 11 days in a collapsed building with no reliable food or water, in a contested zone, with a government tracker in her child's wrist counting down to the next sweep. "The sweep interval," he said. "Do you know it?" 5 hours, she said. And then, with something flat and precise underneath it, the last one was 4 hours and 17 minutes ago. Yusuf processed this. You've been counting. I count everything, she said. It is all I have been able to do. He opened his field kit. She was on her feet before he'd gotten the top fully unlatched. Not fast, not aggressive, but decisive. The kind of movement that came from someone who had already calculated every scenario. And this was the scenario where she moved, child pressed against her chest, her back against the corner wall, her eyes on him with the focused absolute quality of someone who was past fear, and into the country beyond it where only decision lived. I want to remove it, Yusuf said. He did not look up from the kit. He kept his hands moving slowly and visibly, taking out the instruments, placing them on the flat surface of his kit case in a row. The bead. I want to take it out. If I leave now and come back in 43 minutes, you will have another sweep cycle, and I don't know what happens after that. He paused, then he looked at her. I do know what happens after that, he corrected himself. That's why I want to remove it. She did not move. She was looking at his instruments. He followed her gaze, the small field extractor, the topical anesthetic applicator, the wound sealant, the light pen, the magnification lens, the sterile field cloth. All standard trauma kit. Nothing unfamiliar to anyone who'd received medical attention. You've had this done, he said. Not you specifically. But you know what this is. A pause. My household physician, she said. Before. The word before carried enormous weight. He didn't ask before what. Then you know it will take approximately 8 minutes, Yusuf said. And the child will not wake, and there will be no lasting mark. Another pause, longer. He watched her calculating. He watched her cycle through the same probabilities he had already cycled through, the sweep window, the location, the thing she had rather die than allow to happen again, and he waited. He was good at waiting. 11 years of field medicine had taught him that you couldn't rush the moment when a person decided to trust you. You could be ready for it. You could make yourself available to it, but you could not push it. The decision belonged entirely to them. She sat back down in the corner. She extended the child toward him, not handing the child over, not releasing it, just positioning it so he could reach the wrist, her arms still bracketing the small body, her eyes still on his face. If you harm my child, she said, with a calm so complete it was its own kind of violence, I will find a way to make you regret it until the end of your life. I believe you, Yusuf said. He believed her. He worked by the light of the small pen, the beam narrow and directional so it wouldn't show through the collapsed wall. The child was sleeping with the profound unconscious commitment of the very young, the kind of sleep that human infants also slept, the sleep that said the body had decided nothing that happened in the outside world was relevant right now, which was both touching and, in the current circumstances, extremely helpful. Yusuf applied the topical anesthetic to the skin around the bead with careful precision, waiting for the 3 minutes the compound needed to take full effect. He kept his breathing even. He kept his movements small. Beside him he could hear the mother's breathing, that same controlled, sustained rhythm, and he could hear, underneath it, the faint sound of her lips moving. Prayer, he realized, she was praying. He couldn't make out the words, not Veth as he knew it, something older, something that had the quality of liturgy, the cadence structure of words repeated so many times they had worn grooves in the mind, but the sound of it was familiar to him in a way that had nothing to do with language. He had grown up with that sound. His mother made that sound in the kitchen in the mornings under her breath, while she cooked. His grandmother had made it while she worked in her garden. The sound of a person talking to something larger than themselves in the only language they fully trusted. He found himself, without planning to, reciting Al-Fatiha inside his own head, not out loud, not even consciously. It was just there, the way it was always there, the words worn into him by repetition and grief, and the long hours of waiting beside people who might not survive. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. The anesthetic took effect. He made the incision minimal, practiced, less than 2 millimeters, and found the bead with the extractor on the first pass. It came out cleanly. It was smaller than he'd expected, smaller than a match head, its surface smooth and dark, and he held it up in the light of the pen for a moment and looked at it. This small thing, this small piece of machinery, placed in a child who had no say, designed to answer to people the child would never meet, carrying a location like a name that the child hadn't chosen. He closed the wound with the sealant. 6 seconds of pressure, a faint warmth, and the skin sealed itself over the microscopic gap without a mark. He'd done it 10,000 times, probably. 100,000. He'd done it on adults and children and people who were awake and people who weren't, in hospitals and ditches and the backs of vehicles that were still moving. It was a simple thing. He did simple things. That was what he was for. He looked at the bead in his palm. Then he looked at the mother. "I need to take this somewhere it won't ping the sweep," he said. "Far enough that the location won't lead here. Is there somewhere in this zone, any structure you know of that's already been logged, already been searched, that a sweep could find a signal in without?" "The processing station," she said immediately. She had thought about this. She had thought about all of this. 200 meters north. It was evacuated 14 days ago. The VSA ran 3 sweeps through it already. A signal there would look like residual. Residual from what? A pause. "From my household," she said. "We were there before." Again, the weight of that word. Yusuf closed his fist around the bead. "I'll be back," he said. He started to rise. "Why?" she said. He stopped. "Why will you come back?" Her voice was careful, neutral, the question asked the way you asked a question when you could not afford to read hope into the answer. "You have done what you said. The bead is out. The sweep will find it at the station. There is no more reason for you to return." Yusuf looked at her for a moment. The child was still asleep in her arms, breathing with that total unconscious confidence. The mother's face was still, controlled, the face of someone who had used up all their expressions and was working now from first principles. "Because you've been in this corner for 11 days, he said, "and the sweep window is 43 minutes. And I have water and a ration pack and a field blanket, and you're going to need all 3 before I can figure out how to get you out of here." She said nothing. "I'll knock," he said. 3 times, pause twice so you know it's me. He went north. The processing station had been the estate management facility for what Devereaux's briefings called a Grade 4 household. One of the great Veth aristocratic estates, the kind of place that had existed for centuries, managing agricultural production and trade networks across several grids. It had been evacuated when the front moved. Now it was a shell, the equipment stripped out, the data cores removed, the floors covered in the gray ash that Veth computational systems left when they were wiped. The smell of it was sharp and mineral, like crushed stone. Yusuf found a drainage channel in the subfloor and dropped the bead through it. It fell 6 feet into the dark, and he heard it clink against the pipe, and then silence. He stood in the empty station for a moment, in the ash and the smell of wiped data, and thought about the woman in the hut. Nobility, clearly. The clothing, the dialect, the composure, especially the composure. You didn't get composure like that from a life where things generally went the way you wanted. You got it from a life where you had been told from birth that composure was the thing you owed the world regardless of what the world owed you. He had met that kind of composure before in very different circumstances, and it had always moved him in a way he found hard to explain. The discipline of it, the cost of it. Grade 4 household. He thought about that. Grade 4 was not just aristocracy. Devereaux had told him that too in the briefing. Grade 4 was the designation the VSA used for bloodlines that carried what they called succession-eligible lineage. Hereditary governance rights. The kind of thing that empires paid close attention to, because the kind of thing that empires paid close attention to was anything that could organize resistance, anything that carried legitimacy, anything with a name people would follow. The child. Not just a child. Potentially, if the mother was who the clothing and the dialect and the composure suggested she was, a child who was, by Veth law and tradition, and the ordering of their entire political structure, something the VSA had very specific reasons to locate. He stood in the empty processing station and thought about this. Then he went back to the hut. He knocked 3 times, paused twice. The collapsed wall section was exactly as he'd left it. He pushed through carefully and let his eyes adjust. She was in the corner again, but now she was sitting differently, not compressed against the wall in the full defensive posture, but slightly forward, slightly more upright. The child still pressed against her, but the angle different, the angle of someone who had heard a knock they were expecting. He set his field kit down. He took out the water and the ration pack and the field blanket and arranged them in front of her with the same deliberate carefulness as before. Then he sat down. She looked at the water for a moment. Then she picked it up and drank, long and deep and without any pretense of restraint, with the absolute honesty of someone whose body had been overriding their dignity for a long time and had finally been given permission to stop. She handed the bottle back to him. He passed her the ration pack. She examined it briefly. A human product, unfamiliar formulation. He watched her read the nutritional coding on the label with the quick precision of someone literate in multiple systems. And then she opened it and ate. "You're Terran," she said. It wasn't a question. "Pakistani," he said. "Originally, Karachi. My family moved to Leicester when I was 9. She absorbed this. "The island cluster," she said, "the northern one." "England, yes." "Your people have been on this side of the front for how long?" 19 months, he said. 14 in this grid. She nodded, processing. "And before that you were a physician." "I was training to be one. I finished my qualifications in the field." He paused. "Which is not ideal, but it turns out to be effective." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, very slightly, not softening exactly, but adjusting, like a calculation that had produced a new result. "Zarakan Vethatel Sarathos," she said. "That is my name. The child is my son. His name is Irel." Yusuf introduced himself in return, in Veth, properly, with the formal address construction. Her eyebrow moved a fraction, the first involuntary expression he'd seen from her. "You learned the formal register," she said. "I have a good teacher. She charges a lot, but she insists it's the only Veth worth speaking." This time something happened around her eyes that was unmistakably the physical suppression of amusement. "She is correct," said Zarakan Vethatel Sarathos. They sat in the quiet for a while. The child Irel slept on with the profound indifference of the very young to historical significance. Yusuf ate half of a second ration pack. He had brought 3, and listened to the specific silence of a contested zone at midday, which was different from the silence of a contested zone at night and different again from the silences of the zones he'd worked before this one. Each silence with its own texture, its own information. "You know who I am," she said. "Not an accusation, a statement." "I have a general sense," he said. "I don't know specifics." "Specifics," she said, "are that my son is the legitimate heir to the second regency of Sarathos, and that the VSA has been searching for him since 2 days after his birth, when my household was raided and I escaped with him and 3 guards, 2 of whom did not survive the first week." She paused. "The VSA implanted the bead during the raid. My physician removed it. They implanted another. My physician removed that one. This was the 3rd. A pause. My physician did not survive the 2nd week." Yusuf absorbed this. "The VSA will not stop," she said. "They will sweep this grid again in." She checked something, a small motion of her fingers that he realized was her counting intervals, a habit built into her body by 11 days of nothing else to do, 38 minutes now. "The bead at the processing station will read as residual. They will move on. But the next sweep after that, and the one after that, each one is a decision point. I cannot remain here indefinitely. I have no resources remaining to move Irel safely. And if I am found," she stopped, started again. I would not be taken alive. I would not allow my son to be taken at all. She said it without heat. That was what made it land the way it landed. Yusuf looked at the child sleeping in her arms, idle, small and entirely unaware. 4 fingers on one hand and the faint ghost of a sealant mark on his wrist where the bead had been, already almost invisible. He had the particular quality of the very young everywhere, human, Veth, whatever, the quality of existing with complete trust in the immediate present, the way only the very young could exist before the world taught them otherwise. I need to make a call, Yusuf said. To your command. To a specific person in my command, he said. Someone who understands the political dimensions of this. He gestured vaguely at the entire situation. I am a physician. I can keep you and the child alive, and I can run interference on sweep cycles for a while. But I cannot move you out of a contested zone without assets that are above my pay grade. She considered him for a long time. You said pay grade, she said. I know this construction. It is a human idiom. It means the level of authority one has been officially assigned. Yes. Your official authority, she said carefully, does not include this. No. But you are here. Yes. She looked at him with the pale, bioluminescent eyes in the dark of the ruined hut. He could not tell what she was thinking. He suspected that was intentional. Make your call, she said. He made his call. Captain Anais Devereaux picked up on the second ring, which meant she was at her station, which meant the morning briefing was over, which meant Yusuf had a window. He kept his voice low and his words oblique, and gave her enough to understand what he was dealing with without giving her anything that would go on a record in a way that would cause problems later. Devereaux was good at reading oblique. She'd been working intelligence for 6 years. There was a long pause on the other end of the line after he finished. Yusuf, she said. Anais. Where exactly are you? Grid 774. Another pause. That's outside your assessment area. I know. If I ask you why you're in Grid 774, are you going to give me a good answer? I'm going to give you an honest one, which isn't always the same thing. He could hear her thinking. Devereaux thought loudly, not speaking, just the quality of the silence changing as she worked through implications. How old is the child? She asked finally. Very. Is the child, are we talking about a Yusuf? Is this a grade 4 situation? I believe the formal register is appropriate, yes. A very long pause. I need 3 hours, Devereaux said. Do not move. Do not make contact with anyone else. Do not let anyone else see you go in or out of that structure. Can you give me 3 hours? I can give you 2 hours and 51 minutes, he said. After that I'll be managing a sweep response. I'll call you back in 2 hours and 40 minutes, Devereaux said, and disconnected. Yusuf looked at the phone for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket and turned back to the hut. She had heard the call, or enough of it. She was watching him. 2 hours and 40 minutes, he said. For what? For the beginning of an answer, he said. I can't promise it's the right answer, but it will be a real one. She nodded. Then slowly, she shifted the child in her arms and lowered him carefully, settling him in the fold of the blanket Yusuf had brought. Iro resettled himself with a small sound and continued sleeping. Free of the weight, Zara Khan straightened slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had been held in one position for a very long time, and Yusuf saw the extent of it now. The exhaustion, the pallor underneath the iridescent gray-green, the way her hands were shaking faintly when she stretched them, the tremor of muscles that had been held tight for too long and didn't remember how to release. Eat the rest of that, he said, nodding at the ration pack. She ate. He checked her wrists for the signs he'd learned to check for dehydration markers, pressure trauma from sustained cramped posture, the beginning stages of the protein depletion syndrome that hit people who'd been surviving on too little for too long, and made quiet notes in his kit about what he needed to bring back. She tolerated his examination without comment, watching him work with the attentive scientific interest of someone who found competence interesting on its own merits. "Your field instruments," she said, "they are old." "The third revision of the M7 kit," he said. "Yes, we kept requesting the fourth." "The fourth revision has a more sensitive extractor," she said. "Better depth calibration. The one you used, it would have been harder with a deeper set bead." She paused. "I noticed the angle of your approach. You were watching." "I told you I count everything, I watch everything." A pause. "Irl's physician, the one who removed the second bead, had the fourth revision. It was faster." "I'll put in another request," Yusuf said. He meant it as a mild pleasantry, something to ease the air, but she looked at him steadily. "You should," she said. "In the occupation zones there are many children with implants, not only mine." He sat with that for a moment. "I know," he said. "Do your people know?" "Some of them," he said, "the ones who are paying attention." She seemed to consider this. "And the ones who are not paying attention?" "They're learning," Yusuf said. "It takes longer for some people than others. But they learn." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, complex, layered, something that was not quite hope, and not quite its absence, but existed in the territory between. "My grandmother," she said, "told me a thing about your species, when I was very young, before the contact era, before any of this." A gesture at the walls, at the war outside them, at everything. "She told me that humans were the species that did things, that every species in the inhabited systems had its philosophers and its artists and its engineers, but that humans were the species where all three collapsed into the same person without warning, that a human doctor might also be a fighter, that a human fighter might also be a poet, that you did not arrange yourselves into categories the way other species did, and this made you." She used a word I will translate as chaotic, but she did not mean it pejoratively. She meant it as generative, productive of new things. Yusuf thought about his grandmother's kitchen, the smell of it, the sound of prayer under her breath while she cooked. "She sounds like a perceptive woman," he said. "She was the finest mind I have ever known," said Zara Khan Vetha Tel Sorathos. "She was also, toward the end, unreasonably fond of your species specifically, which my advisors considered an eccentricity." The ghost of something passed through her face. "I have begun to think she was right." The sweep came 40 minutes later. Yusuf felt it before he heard it, a low subsonic vibration that human bodies registered as vague unease, the kind of feeling that made people check over their shoulders without knowing why. Zara Khan felt it too. He saw her hands go still on the blanket over Irl. They sat in silence while the sweep ran through the grid, and he imagined it. The VSA's signal fan moving through the broken buildings, the rubble, the mineral walls, finding the dormant bead at the processing station 200 meters north and registering it and moving on. The vibration faded. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Residual," Zara Khan said. "Residual," Yusuf confirmed. Irl stirred, made a small disgruntled sound, and then subsided back into sleep. His left hand came up and wrapped itself loosely around the edge of his mother's wrist, the small fingers curling there with the absolute trust of the very young for the nearest available warmth. Zara Khan looked at her son's hand on her wrist. She looked at it for a long time. "He does not know," she said quietly, not to Yusuf, to herself or to something beyond either of them. "He will not remember any of this. None of the 11 days, none of the cold, none of the counting." "No," Yusuf said. "Good." She said it firmly, the way you said something when you needed it to be true and were compelling it with the sound of your own voice. He thought about the things his own children, if he ever had children when this was over, in the life that existed after this, would not know about. The ditches, the equipment that failed at the wrong moment, the faces, the counting, the specific quality of the silences. Good, he agreed. Devereaux called back in 2 hours and 38 minutes, which was 2 minutes early, which meant she'd moved fast. She gave him a grid reference, a time, and a single word that functioned as a code name for an extraction team. The kind of team that didn't show up on standard manifests, the kind whose existence was known to about 7 people in the 14th, 4 of whom were currently in this conversation. This is above my level, Devereaux said. I want you to know that. I made 3 calls I'm going to have to account for later. I know, Yusuf said. Thank you, Anais. Don't thank me. Just get to the grid reference. 2 hours. She disconnected. Yusuf briefed Zara Khan. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked 3 questions. The extraction team's organizational affiliation, the chain of custody protocol for diplomatic status passengers, and the legal framework under which the extraction would operate. All 3 questions were exactly the right questions. He answered them as fully as he could, which was not as fully as she deserved, because he didn't know all the answers, but he told her what he knew, and he told her clearly where his knowledge ended. She considered this. You trust this person, she said, Devereaux. Yes. Why? Because she has never told me something was safe when it wasn't, he said. She's told me things were uncertain. She's told me things were bad. She has never told me a thing was safe when it was dangerous, because she knows I need accurate information more than I need comfort. Zara Khan considered this. That, she said, is a specific and meaningful kind of trustworthiness. Yes, he said, it is. Getting to the extraction grid required crossing 300 meters of contested zone, in daylight, with a newborn. Yusuf did not minimize this in his briefing to Zara Khan. She did not ask him to. They discussed it factually, the risk points, the sight lines, the rubble cover available along the most direct route, the timing relative to the standard VSA patrol intervals Yusuf had logged during his assessment work over the past 2 weeks. She had been in this corner for 11 days and she knew the patrol intervals too, had counted them the way she counted everything, and her numbers and his numbers matched exactly, which was useful and also, he reflected, slightly humbling. The plan, such as it was, move in the 40-minute gap between sweeps, use the rubble line along the eastern edge of the grid, lower profile, better cover, adds 90 meters to the route but keeps them out of 3 visible sight lines. Yusuf carries the kit. Zara Khan carries Iril. They move quietly and quickly and they trust the window. She did not argue with any part of it. She made 2 modifications, a minor route adjustment based on something she'd observed from the hut's vantage point over 11 days, and a timing shift of 4 minutes to account for a patrol variance she'd noticed. He accepted both modifications. They were improvements. They left with 22 minutes in the window. The contested zone was quiet in the way contested zones were quiet at midday. The birds had come back, which meant no active fire nearby, which was the most reliable indicator Yusuf had found in 19 months of doing this. The rubble smelled of mineral dust and old smoke, and something green coming up through the cracks where vegetation was reasserting itself against the damage. His boots were quiet on the broken stone. Beside him, Zara Khan moved with a stillness that was extraordinary. The stillness of someone who had spent 11 days learning to exist without making sound, who had built silence into her body the way you built a reflex. Iril slept the whole way. The extraction team was a vehicle, and 3 people who gave no names and showed credentials that Yusuf would not have been able to verify even if he'd tried. Devereaux had described them in exactly enough detail for him to recognize them and no more. They were professional and quiet, and they did not ask Zara Khan unnecessary questions. One of them, a small woman with the flat, competent manner of someone who had done this specific job many times, moved immediately to examine Iril with the kind of medical assessment that told Yusuf she was also a physician, or something close to it. He watched her work and recognized the checklist she was running and felt, for the first time in several hours, something that was not quite relief but was in the same family. Zara Khan watched the woman examine her son. Her hands at her sides were still. Her face was still. She had reassembled everything into the formal composure she'd been trained for, the composure that cost what it cost and never let you see the price. Then the woman looked up from her examination and said something to Zara Khan in what sounded like a formal Veth register. And Zara Khan's face changed, just briefly, just for a moment, with an expression that was not composure, not training, not the product of anything that could be learned. The expression of a mother hearing the words her child is well. She turned to Yusuf. "Thank you," she said, in English. Her accent was precise and careful and clearly constructed from study rather than immersion, but the words were right. "Alhamdulillah," Yusuf said, because it was what his grandmother would have said, because it was what felt true. All praise to God in the original sense of the phrase, the sense that meant this good thing happened and I am aware that it is larger than me. Zara Khan's eyes moved to him. Something crossed her face, recognition, he thought, or something close to recognition, the expression of someone hearing a word that exists in their own vocabulary, but in a different language. "Yes," she said, in whatever the Veth equivalent was, and then, after a pause, "I would like to know your full name, to remember it correctly." "Yusuf Khalid," he said. "Dr. Yusuf Khalid, 14th Expeditionary Field Medical Corps." She repeated it carefully, once, as if memorizing. Then she looked at him steadily, in the way she had looked at him across the darkness of the ruined hut, the pale eyes with the bioluminescent iris, the controlled face, the composure that was not distance but was its own kind of presence. "Then I will remember it correctly," she said. He watched them go. The vehicle moved out of the grid quickly and quietly, and then it was gone, and the contested zone settled back into its particular midday silence, and the birds were still there, and somewhere under the rubble something green was still growing. He stood for a moment, then he picked up his field kit. He had 4 grids left to assess before end of day. He was behind schedule. He would need to move quickly. He started moving. In the inside front pocket of his field kit, folded small, was the record he kept for himself. Not the official record, not the manifests and the tags and the assessment charts, but the small notebook he'd bought in Leicester when he was 16 from a shop on Belgrave Road that he was fairly sure was still there, give or take the war and the years. He'd had it refilled 6 times. On the inside cover, in handwriting that had changed significantly between the first entry and the last, were 3 words. His grandmother had told him to write them there. He'd asked her why 3 words, what they meant, and she had told him, "They mean that you are not walking alone, Habib, even when it feels like you are, especially then." He had never found a reason to disagree with her. He walked. Behind him, in the direction the vehicle had gone, something that was possibly the future. One of the possible futures. One of the futures that had not been here 4 hours ago. One of the futures that existed only because a man had kept his feet when his instincts told him otherwise, and sat on a cold floor, and offered water was in motion. The birds sang. The green thing grew. Dr. Yusuf Khalid, 14th Expeditionary Field Medical Corps, walked forward through the particular silence of a contested zone at midday and headed for the next grid. He was behind schedule. He was not walking alone.